Okay, the first thing I did was jump into SketchUp and start designing the cabinet. So here I'm just designing the overall size of the cabinet carcass. I had an idea of how tall the cabinet needed to be, how wide the cabinet needed to be to fit in the space. So now I'm just playing with the idea of how many drawers do I want, how many cabinet doors do I want, what the materials for the door faces should be, and the style of the legs. So just kind of conceptually laying out how the cabinet will look, and then ultimately generating a cut list from this design. And here's a look at the final design that I went with. Black walnut door faces, black walnut legs. I chose to have the M.Greene of the plywood showing on the carcass to match the floating shelves in the kitchen, and then a vinyl for the door faces and the top of the carcass. And here I'm just ripping down the plywood for the carcass and then cutting the carcass to its final dimensions on the table saw and moving over to the miter saw to cut the dividers for the carcass. The next step is just assembling the cabinet carcass. Pretty straightforward and simple cabinet. I'm just using some brackets to keep everything square. I glued each piece of wood and then secured it with 1¼ screws, I believe, through the bottom so you don't see the screw faces. After getting the carcass assembled, I moved on to cutting all the pieces for the drawers. So just set up a couple stop blocks on my miter saw and cut all the drawer components. After cutting down all the drawer box components, I moved to the table saw and cut a 1/4-inch dado through each component of the box. That way a 1/4-inch piece of plywood could slide in for the bottom of each of the drawer boxes. Unfortunately, my camera died during the drawer box assembly, but they're pretty straightforward. Just 3/4-inch plywood for the sides and then a 1/4-inch piece of plywood for the bottom that just slid into that dado. Now I'm just marking out the black walnut for the drawer faces, and you'll notice that I actually have 4 drawers instead of 3 in the design, and this is because I just had some extra plywood after all the offcuts. Now I didn't have enough black walnut for all the sides, so I ended up matching the cabinet door with that laminate that you just stick on with contact cement. Time to start prepping the door faces for finish. That means just sanding the door faces starting at 120 grit and going up to 320 grit. Nothing terribly exciting here, just running the back and fronts on my orbital sander. One of the main goals of this project was to build it using as much scrap material as possible. This helped keep the cost down, but it also prevented a lot of waste, especially when it came to the finishes. I had a lot of cans of finish taking up space on the shelf that only had an eighth of a can left or a quarter of a can left. And while I'd never do this on a customer piece, for something like this that's going to be a dog food cabinet that's going to stay in my house, I thought it was a great way to use up the rest of these finishes and not let anything go to waste. Next, it was time to start building the legs for the cabinet. These are just the offcut pieces from the door faces, and I put them on my table saw sled and cut a 30-degree angle on them and then just glued them together. So I don't have a bench top sander, so I had to make do and just clamp my orbital sander to my bench. So after the glue had dried for the legs, I just quickly sanded off that glue squeeze out and any rough areas on the legs. After finishing sanding the legs, it was time to move on to assembling the door faces and then putting on the last coat of finish for the legs. And again, I'm just using some leftover poly I had in the garage. So while that was drying, I started to get the contact cement ready to adhere the laminate vinyl to the door face and the drawer face and the top of the cabinet. And this goes on really easy. You just apply the cement to both sides of your surface, stick it on there, use a J roller to adhere it to both sides, and take a flush trim router bit and then just run it along all the edges to get that nice clean look. After the legs had dried, it was time to assemble them to the carcass. And normally I would use wood joinery for this or specific hardware for this, but again, I was trying to keep the cost down, so that just meant using a little bit of wood glue and CA glue, and then I screwed the legs in from the inside of the cabinet. And again, it's just going to hold dog food and it's a cabinet for me, so I don't mind seeing those screw faces in the inside of the cabinet. And the last step was just to install this last drawer face and then just make sure that everything is aligned and all the drawers work and the doors work. So now it's time to show you a before shot of why I built this cabinet. So you'll notice I have the dog food on our dining room table. It's just kind of a cluttered mess. We have some of his leashes and collars in like a steel bin by the door, and some of the towels we use to wipe his paws off coming in and out of the house. So I really wanted to have something to store all this, have it organized and ready. So clearly we needed some type of remedy to fix this.